Hello everybody, my name is Jean-Claude Girard and it's a great pleasure to be with you today at this workshop. Thank you Asian for inviting me, and especially thanks to 𝗟𝗲𝗵𝗱𝗍𝗪 who I met several years ago in Manila. Before starting, I would like just to introduce me briefly. I am a Swiss architect based in Geneva, where I have my own practice. We're doing projects like renovation or competitions, and I'm also teaching at a bachelor degree for the construction and the project. And a few years ago, I started a research on Filipino architect Leandro Valencia Locsin, and completed the PhD in 2018 under the supervision of Professor Bruno Marchand at the Polytechnical School in Lausanne. So let's start the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So the title of the presentation is The Global Perceptions of the Architecture of Leandro Locsin. Leandro Locsin who is very famous in the Philippines. He was a national artist, was born in 1928 and died in 1994. And his career was pretty amazing because the amount of projects he designed and built is just stunning. So today I would like to show you how I actually started the research, the methodology, and then show you kind of the result, or let's say themes, or subjects that Leandro Locsin worked on all his life and that we can find in a lot of projects, let's say. So let's start with how I met Leandro Locsin. Obviously, I didn't meet him because I went to the Philippines several times for holidays first, and in 2012 we moved there with my family because my wife got a post-PhD grant doing research as well on the Philippines. So when I was there, I started to look at Locsin's buildings, because the same day I bumped, let's say, or actually I visited, or I saw two main buildings, his office in Makati, in Ayala Triangle, and the theater for the Cultural Center of the Philippines on Manila Bay. So I was really, really impressed by the strength of this architecture. So I asked my friends there, my Filipino friends, to know if who was this architect, and they told me it's Leandro Locsin. So I decided to get into his work, and for that I met his son, Leandro Locsin Jr., or Andy, who is now running the office in Makati, and he opened the vault with all the archives that they kept all this year on his father's work. So you can see on the right one of the first plans of Locsin's office in 1955, which is the chapel in Diliman. So probably one of the most published work of Locsin. What I discovered then is that Locsin was not doing only one theater and one chapel, but he did actually so many projects. It was really, really impressive. So at the end of my let's say my life in the Philippines, because we quit the Philippines at the end of 2013, but every morning I went to the office and I took pictures of every project I could find, just to have an idea and to do like a summary of his work. And I found like more than 240 projects. Probably there is more, I don't know, but that's what I found in the archives. From residential projects like villas, but as well hotels, churches, administrative buildings, and obviously public buildings like theaters and different, or palace. So when I was at this stage, I had to find some way to classify this work and to try to understand them. That's what I did in the research. I started to read about him and see if there is a lot or not. But the first text that I found that Leandro Locsin wrote, because he didn't write a lot of things. He was not a theoretician, let's say, or maybe he didn't have time for that because he was so busy with his career. So I found the elusive Filipino 𝗟𝗏 in architecture that was published in Exchange, which was really interesting because it was probably the first time that someone was going back into history and take into account the Bayan Kubo and the climate of the Philippines to start an architecture that can be truly Filipino and not a colonial architecture. But that was not a lot of text from Locsin, so I tried to find what was published on him. So there was one book very famous from Polites in 1977, and then another book when he passed away from Villalón Pérez, and a PhD from Karim Paredes Santillan in 2007. So that was not a lot of text to understand his work, and some publications or articles were included inside books like the Licor Architecture Gang Filipino or the Violent Klassen Architecture in the Philippines. So to try to understand, I had to really read the projects through the plans. That's what I did with this slide. So I had a list of work with publication, but mostly with archives, where I could just separate them into different architectural areas, and then try to put them into, let's say, into perspective with the artistical scenes, politics, but as well like international architecture. So mix this, let's say, a very practical area, his projects, let's say, and with something more theoretical. And then I arrive at the case studies and at the thesis. And so let's say I began from the design and going to the theory. But at the end, I'm really architect, so I'm not a theoretician. And I have this interest, let's say, to read projects and to try to understand how Locsin worked on this project, what was the themes, the subject, why. And so that's how I try to classify his work. And in this file, you can see here is the start of his career. In 1955, he graduated in 1953, and until the end, let me just get that, at the end of his career in 1994 when he passed away. And then you have different line where on the first one, the biggest is the villas, the private residentials. So I call them to live. Then you have a few projects like condominium. Then you have the equipment, then the religious buildings, the administrative buildings, and then the hotels. So this structure is was very useful to understand a little bit more how Locsin was working, and at the same time how it was connected to the political scene in the Philippines, and how it was connected as well as regarding the development of Manila, because Manila was, as you know, completely bombed during the World War II, and they moved. They decided to move the administrative center, the downtown, into Makati. So this was a huge change, for the administrative building, obviously, but also for the villas, because they started to build a gated community called 𝗿𝗵𝗶𝘁𝗍𝗏, first of all 𝗿𝗵𝗶 in the 𝗓𝗏, or these areas around Makati, for clients that was quite not wealthy, but not people without money, let's say. So that these people needed new private residence, and you can see here, for example, that Locsin got so many comments at these times that he built. Like for the villas, for example, I found more than 110 projects. I don't know exactly how many were built because some are destroyed already, but it's a lot. And then obviously you have this very important meetings, like with Fernando 𝗂𝗏𝗏, his mentor, who introduced him to art and who gave him the first buildings on Ayala Avenue. In 1966, Marcos arrived and had the power and started to develop this new trend toward national identity in different fields, and especially in architecture with Imelda Marcos. So we started to build the cultural center of the Philippines. And then you can see, for example, here when Aquino was shot at the airport, that Philippines enter a very complicated period, let's say, and like you can see that there is less projects going on at the office. So this structure is basically the structure of the PhD. I had to classify this project in order to have an idea and to rationalize, let's say, this work, because if not, I was lost at some point to really have a precise idea of global perceptions, let's say. So this structure, you will find it in the PhD. But so everybody knows that this Locsin started his career with a very famous chapel in Diliman, the Holy Sacrifice Chapel, in 1955. He was lucky because he got this comment, and he had a project before when he was a student, also for a church. So I managed to visit it, and I managed to find the plans, so the blueprints that were in the vaults. And I came several times after in Manila to save actually this archive. So I asked my friend 𝗟𝗏𝘁𝗍𝗏, who is a photographer based in Manila, very famous photographer, to actually shot some of the plans of every project. So now I have a complete view of his work, of Leandro Locsin's work, but as well, even if the documents disappeared for some reason, I have them saved. And now that's these documents that I am using actually in the book I will be publishing in the next month. So that's a picture of Diliman, the Holy Sacrifice Chapel, with this amazing concrete vaults. So that was something that was very published and very known, but the rest was pretty unknown. So that's what I would like to now go into more projects. So I said before that there was not a lot of text from Leandro Locsin himself, but some sentences are really interesting. And this one was kind of the start of my research. He said that architecture in the Philippines obviously is connected to his past, which passed from the Spanish one, the Americans one, where they were under the colonization. But that for him, what is very interesting in Locsin is that he was not against that, but actually he took advantage of all this past and he tried to integrate everything into his architecture. So he said, for this reason, one often wonders whether there is a true Filipino architecture, and the answer is yes, but it is complex, subtle, constantly changing, and therefore difficult to understand. And that was my goal, to understand his architecture and see what is Filipino architecture. So, as I said before, the presentation today is based on the book, on the chapters of the book I will be published, and not on the chapter of the PhD. The reason is I had to classify for the PhD to have a more rationalized or scientific view of the work of Leandro Locsin's work. But for the book, I think it would be much more interesting to not classify the project by program, the administrative building or the public buildings or the residential, but more by themes. And one of the main themes I discover, and obviously it's the most known themes in Locsin architecture, because it's more shown in the cultural center of the Philippines that he planned in 1965, 66 more or less, and he started to build a theater, but also the rest behind. And this theme is the new monumentality, because after World War II, the modernity was really in crisis regarding how can we do monuments, because there was no monument in the modernity before. But after World War II, a lot of nations had to redefine the national identity, as I said before, through art or literature, and obviously through architecture. So we saw a lot of countries like the Bangladesh with Louis Khan or Kuwait with John Hudson that built parliaments as gigantic structure. But what is interesting in the Philippines is that they actually try to redefine this national identity through cultural center buildings. And for Locsin, this was really an opportunity to do, like he said, a gigantic sculpture, what he called hollow-out sculpture. And he went really far into abstraction. These buildings can be seen as like big sculpture and not really architecture. But he said that architectural structure are gigantic sculpture, except that you go inside architecture, you live inside. So for him, it's the big difference. And what is really interesting is he was talking about the materiality, the concrete. I work in concrete, a sculptural material. You can start shaping a structure outside and continue it inside for harmony, coherence. So it's really interesting, because when you see the theater or the Philippine International Conference Center, it's really abstract. You have like big mass floating on the ground, and you barely see windows, for example. So when you see the building from far away, you think it's not a building, but more like a gigantic sculpture. And that's really interesting how Locsin worked on that. But and he did a lot of projects around that. So the CCP, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, we know the theater or the International Conference Center, like here in the PICC, but also inside the theater. But we know, in maybe less, that he was supposed to build a huge museum complex just beside the theater that was not built, actually. But and at the same time, so a little bit later, he built in the same way the Dinumani Hall in Los Baños, at the University of the Philippines in Los Baños, which is a very strong building as well, very abstract, with just this big roof going to welcome people inside. And as well, the Ayala Museum that is now destroyed. It was replaced by the new Ayala Museum. But when you see these buildings, they are really like sculpture and not really architecture. So Locsin was really able to work on abstraction to give us a feeling to people who are visiting the building that they are in presence of something else that's just cultural equipments. What is interesting and what I discovered during this research is that some people said that Locsin actually developed this language of abstraction, monumentality, because he got the CCP projects, but actually it's not really true, because he started a different project before where he was using abstraction, a long span structure, and it's very interesting because he was using it. I found this project that I'm showing you here, this perspective of a garage, basically, Fiat Motor building in Quezon City, which is it looks very alike the CCP, but it was in 1961, so 5 years before the theater. So Locsin was really into this interest toward monumentality, even for programs that were relatively simple or basic, like a garage for cars. And in the same year, he built this famous commercial credit corporation building in Makati, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, where he did the same work on abstraction by using this time here metal to hide the windows again. So basically you have you can read this building just in two parts. The below part where you have this colonnade that reminds the Brazilian architecture of Niemeyer, obviously, and on top of that you have this part of the building which is just offices, but he's simplifying the form because inside it's just offices with 2 floors, but you cannot see it. So Locsin was working on this monumentality even for administrative building. And when you go through the archives, I found this interesting project, not in Manila this time, but in Tarlac, and it's a very basic administrative office building. But again, he used a very long span to build the roof, and at the end, the building is like a big roof supported by 2 walls. So it's very abstract. And then on the side, you can see the windows, but it's just lines. So you can see that it's in 1965, before the CCP, before the climax, let's say, of this monumentality. Locsin was already working on expression of monumentality even for office buildings. And then if you go a little bit deeper in the blueprints, that's the original plans of the theater, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the CCP. So you have the plans of the theater and you have the sections. And what amazed me really is the contrast between exterior and interior. And you can see here in the section the work done on the stair that probably everybody knows, but this very like animal design, like organic thing that Locsin introduced into the building that looks from outside very abstract. So these 2 sides of his architecture really fascinates me, and that's why I went deeper into his influences, and I went into the what I call the learning period. Learning period is like in just after he started his career in 1965, let's say. He took 2 trips that were very important for him. One to Japan in 56, and another one in the United States in 1959. And from these 2 trips, he brought something for his architecture to the Philippines. He brought themes and materiality. And he said, for the Japan, for example, the most important lesson learned in that fateful trip in 1960 was to observe how traditional forms in a specific culture could be rendered with a contemporary spirit which transcends time and fashion. And that's really the architecture of Leandro Locsin. It's this mix of tradition and modernity, and this duality that you can find in probably every building you can see. So I show you the 2 buildings that are quite different. One is the Church of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Quezon City, and the other one is the Student Union, just next to the 𝗬𝗎𝘶𝘍𝘬 I showed you before, with his colonnade, very classic. And from the trips, from both these trips, he came back with different ideas, the tradition and the modernity, but also the classicism and the organicism. And his architecture is always in between these things. So the trip to Japan, I called that chapter Tradition and Modernity, because he visited a lot of temples. He went with Fernando Zobel, his mentor there, just before starting the Monterrey apartments building on Ayala Avenue. Doesn't exist anymore as well. And just before starting the studies, he went there, and he came fascinated by the way the exterior and the interior are merged. It's like a fusion for him, and he started to design this very modernist perspective in the modernist way, let's say, where you barely see where the building starts and where it ends. So that was a lesson learned from the Japan and how he can mix the natural flowers and water with modern buildings. But what is interesting and what I found in the archive as well is this section. It's a detail of the balcony here. He was working with civil engineer Junior at that time, very famous, probably one of the best civil engineer at that time. And they have a lot of trouble to find a way to carry the charge, to carry the balcony, because they were too long. So with the metal inside, it was too heavy to have the capacity to carry the balcony. So we decided to incorporate, instead of metal, they incorporate bamboo. And it's amazing because it was working just by integrating a very local kind of construction into a very modern building. And that's really Japan that gave to Locsin this way of thinking. I showed you before the entrance hall perspective of the Monterrey apartment, but now I can show you how he was working the same way for different kind of programs. So the 2 first pictures are villas, residential. One is one of the first he built, and I visited it in Quezon City, the residential bungalow Fernado, with the entrance sequence and with this little bridge going on top of a water pond that goes inside the house. So he's really merging interior and exterior. It's the same with the famous 𝗿𝗏𝗄 residence, where the entrance is like a garden inside the house. So you barely see where the house starts. And it's fascinating. And it's the same with the Davao Hotel he built in 1959, in Davao City, where all the pathway or the distribution of the of the building are open to the surrounding. So Locsin doesn't do difference between programs in terms of how to design the entrance hall. He's just always merging outside and inside. So when he went to the States, the United States, he met a lot of people, especially Eros Saarinen, and he met as well Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson just built his house in New Canaan, and he was really into this phase of classicism back into the architecture with the use of the columns. And Locsin has this duality between organism and classicism, and probably Philip Johnson was a big influence for him. And you can see, for example, in this chapel at De La Salle in Bacolod City, the use of the columns is very classic. It surrounds the buildings all around, and it's symmetrical with below part connected to the ground, the columns, and then the upper part. It's like a little temple, Greek temple. So at the beginning of his career, he was looking into classicism and see how he could really integrate it into the climate of the Philippines. But what he took back as well from the United States, it's the concrete, the materiality, because he went to visit Mies van der Rohe buildings, obviously, but he said metal is not for the Philippines because of the climate, because of the humidity. So he said, forget about the metal. We will use concrete in the Philippines because it's much more obvious. So he was convinced about that. And all his career was almost done with this materiality, the concrete, exception maybe for some houses, but most of his buildings were built in one material, the concrete. So this classicism, you can see it in the big theater at the CCP, this Agora that is covered by a big roof. It reminds me architecture, obviously, but in small projects like very unknown, let's say, like Mausoleum that I found in the archives, also he used the columns to give a sense of monumentality and classicism into his architecture, even for small project, let's say. But in the United States, as I said before, he met Eros Saarinen, who was in the process of building the TWA airport, Kennedy Airport, and with his big organic forms, and he was really fascinated by his work. And in 1967, so like 8 years ago, he built the St. Andrew Apostolic Parish Church in Makati, which still exists. Unfortunately, it was painted with white color. It's not really interesting now, but the shape is really amazing. And you can see this form in the layout of the plan is like someone said a butterfly, obviously, but for me, it's more like a seashell, maybe back to the Philippines climate or what you can find on the beaches. But so you see that in between De La Salle and St. Andrew Church, there is a huge gap in terms of expression, but it is always built with concrete. And then another example is the Church of Immaculate Heart of Mary in Quezon City. I showed just after St. Apostol Church. And here it's really obvious that Locsin was working on organicism with this spiral who is developing to build this huge roof. And the plan is really amazing. That's the plan from the archives I found. the details of the structure, the long span structure that are supporting the roof. So you can see that Locsin is always not hesitating, but using actually either columns or organicist architecture to develop his project. Another theme that is really, really important in Locsin architecture is what I call moving grounds. Because when you go through all these archives, it's fascinating how Locsin is actually connecting his buildings to the ground, to the surrounding. As I said before, interior, exterior are really not clearly defined. And there is different project. For example, this one is really unknown. It's a chapel that was never built in Parañaque. He built another one nearby, but not this one. And it's really amazing how actually the ground is going up around this wall that actually welcoming ramps going down. And at the end, it's like a big structure, big sculpture, like as if it emerged from the ground. And you could say that maybe it's just because it's the public building, it's for religious purpose, but not at all. We'll see after that later that he's really caring about the way the people are going into his building and how they are welcoming into his building. And again, the concrete is really, really important for him because it gives him the opportunity to do that architecture. And he said, I work in concrete, a sculptural material. You can start shaping a structure outside and continue it inside for harmonic coherence. So there is this really this way of thinking the project not as something isolated, but as something that is merged with the environment. You can see the same process in the National Art Center, again in Los Baños. It's the theater, this pyramid that's pretty amazing on top of the mountain, nearby the Montmartre. And again, the relationship, the connection with the outside is spectacular in this case because the theater, the benches for the public is actually outside the theater. And in this section from the archives, you can see how Locsin shaped actually the ground to integrate all the project into the environment, the surroundings. And it's the same with this project, the population center in Makati, that actually seems to emerge from the ground with this lean wall, let's say in concrete. And you can see the original section here that was much more developed than it is actually today, how it is built today. But the building seems to be just one thing emerging from the ground, actually merging with it. So not something disconnected, but something that is actually really a part of the surrounding, part of the land it belongs. If the population center is quite well known in Locsin production, I found some projects that were never built and very unknown, like in Kuwait City. He did a huge conference center, and in this conference center there was a hotel, a main hall, and as well a mosque. And it's really amazing how actually he kind of surround the mosque, the space for prayers, around, in the middle of gardens that are emerging from the grounds, like and planted with the vegetation. So at the end, the mosque it's just this small space, but at the end he built a very large scale garden, let's say, to integrate the mosque into the environment. So I said before that the continuity, the moving grounds is not only for the public buildings. You can see obviously in the theaters at the CCP, the long ramp going up to the main entrance in concrete is where arrive at this part of the building where the pillars are actually curves, like as if they were coming from the ground, and doing the building as if it was part of the surrounding. But it's the case for different projects, like this hotel that was never built in Bali. I don't know exactly the date, I couldn't find it. But again, the section shows how the ground is actually connecting inside, outside, inside the building with a hall, a patio, and then the pool and everything. So he's very caring about how buildings are touching the ground and how the ground are reacting to the buildings. And here is a section of his house, actually. And it's the same. It's very, very complicated. I mean, in the good way, how the ground is moving with patio in the middle, and you have these steps and another one, and to define space and make the building part of the environment. Another chapter of the book will be what I call climate reaction facades, because obviously Philippines has a very specific climate with a lot of humidity, but a lot of wind and a lot of sun as well. So Locsin carefully designed the facade in order to react to the climate. And 𝗟𝗲𝗵𝗱𝗄𝘕, who was a famous architect, a little bit older than Locsin, said at some point that the sunbreaker became the epitome of local modern architecture, like a trademark to be stamped on the buildings, on the facade of the buildings, regardless of its useful values. And for Locsin, it's absolutely not the case, because the way he thinks the facades is usually in a way to integrate the interior and the exterior. And in this section, for example, it's really amazing how for sport facilities, he actually designed the facade in order to protect the interior from the sun and from the rain, to do the cross ventilation through the building, and as well integrate the seats for the spectators. So it's not what 𝗟𝗲𝗵𝗱𝗄𝘕 said, like something stamped on the building, but it's actually completely integrated as part of the design. And you can see that in different programs again, like for example on Makati Avenue, the Sarmiento office building, who is like a big structure with hanging or suspended concrete panels that actually are sunbreaker. And it looks like a kind of a wooden building, let's say. The structure is kind of traditional. It reminds a little bit of tongue architecture, with a suspending concrete, which is quite unusual. But at the end, it's part of the building, and it's the principal design of the facade. And one of a very interesting example is obviously his office on Ayala Triangle, the Locsin building, where he goes very far into abstraction by designing the sunbreakers on the facade, and he's actually separating all the elements in plans, like the structure. The angles are open, so it's a very open plans, and then he disconnect as well the elements of the sunbreaker outside. So at the end, you have this building that looks like a gigantic sculpture as well, because it looks like elements are just combined together, but they actually have a functions from inside, from the office, like in the angles, but also from outside to protect all the windows here, the window of the office, from the climate. So we could say that in this case, Locsin goes very far into abstraction again, because he could just design a basic office building, but not. He's using the climate as a strength to do something with the architecture of the Sunbreaker. And the last chapter is a bit different from the other one, because in the other one I mixed programs, as I said, like public building, administrative, hotel, etc. But in this chapter, it's only about residential. And why is that? Because what I found, I mean, for me, the villas was for Locsin the opportunity to develop a new language in Filipino architecture by making the design to make it evolve, let's say. So actually, it's not about a theme, but it's about a new language for domestic architecture. And Leandro Locsin, to introduce this chapter, said, although the Villa 𝗏, which is on this picture I took when I visited it, has a definite Oriental flavor, because you can see obviously Japanese influences, it is unmistakably Filipino in its easy mingling of Eastern and Western influences, not unlike the Filipino himself, whose culture is a blend of East and West. And for me, it's very important to remind that Locsin is not against what happened before, let's say, with the Spanish or with the Americans, what they brought to the Philippines, but he actually took advantage of that. He started his domestic architecture with what was built before, let's say the Bayan Kubo, obviously, but as well the Bayan Nabato, and then the bungalow from the Americans. So he's blending all these influences together to develop his domestic architecture. So it's a very dense chapter in the book. I won't be able to show you a lot of villas because there is more than 100, but I think it's just interesting to see how he started his work, because Villa 𝗏 was kind of a landmark in this development. But before that, what I found in the archives, so you see the quality of the archives are really bad because of they are very old, but at least we have every blueprints of the houses. So that's the first house he really designed, the Chongban in Cebu. And actually on the blueprint it's written bungalow residential every time. So I found out that Locsin started his residential projects by integrating the bungalow, which was at the beginning a villa, an habitation just for modest people, very small house, like 2 rooms and 1 living room and a kitchen, obviously, and with a very basic construction. So he started to design these houses, and he always mentioned bungalow on the blueprints. And then the problem of the demands of the clients, let's say, make him evolve this basic layout by putting on one side, let's say, the maid office or maid quarter, and then on the other side the main place where people are living, and in between you have usually a space that is welcoming the people from the street or from outside. And you have this organization, for example, in this Fernado house that I visited, this duality between the entrance that is usually in the center. So here I just found the electrical plan. There was no other blueprints of this house. On the left, you have the main place with the living room and the kitchen in the back. And on the right, you have the rooms. So this tripartite disposition is really often in Locsin residential architecture. But as you see, the construction is very simple, very basic with wood, and it looks like a small bungalows. And this was a problem at some point because the clients were more wealthy and asking for more space, and the expression will start to change. And here you can see the plan and the picture of the Villa Ho I showed just before. And you see the plan is actually organized in three parts. Like on the left you have the bedrooms, on the right you have the facilities like the carport, the kitchen, the maid's room, etc. And in the middle you have the principal spaces like the living room or the dining room, and the patio in front where the entrance is, in the middle to give light inside the house, and in front with the connection to the garden. So Locsin starts to change the perception of the domestic architecture because he had to build big houses. But this principle of 3 parts of the house is really, really common in his residential architecture. So this is some view of the picture taken by Akio Kawasumi. So he was very fantastic photographer with the entrance sequence I showed before, but as well inside the house with the patio that gives light to the house, but also give air inside with to introduce ventilation inside the house. If there is on one side this 3 parts plan, there is on the other side the plan which goes in other direction, and I mean different directions, let's say. Plan éclaté, we said in French, and it's very famous in this house of James Zobel de Ayala in Makati, where actually you can go inside the house here, but you can go on the left, you can go on the right, and it's very articulated. And the articulation of the plan gives the opportunity to connect again the interior with the exterior by blending the architecture and nature. And here in 1962, he built his own house, which was the start, let's say, of a new domestic architecture, a reference into the development of the villas residential after. And what is interesting is that if the bungalow is a very light construction with a roof that can be seen from inside the house, Locsin actually use the roof now as a cover. And you see the difference here. The structure of the roof is not expressed, but he's using false ceiling to actually do the spatiality of the house in connection with the space that is under the roof. And it's really new because it means that the roof has its own life, let's say, and it's not just the result of the construction, but it's actually there to structure the space inside architecture. But again, in terms of layout, you see this middle part that is the entrance with patio on both sides, the main living room, the dining room, and on each side you have bedrooms, so the private part, and here the public part with the kitchen and the maid's rooms. So again, even if the plan is really articulated in front of the garden to make the nature go inside the house, the layout is again 3 parts, very simply organized, let's say. So Locsin, from this point, will design more than 100 residences, and they will be always based on the same layout, almost, with different variations, let's say. But the principle is always there, always three parts connected together, let's say. So I'm now at the end of my presentation. I hope I gave you a perception of Locsin architecture. I take back this slide I showed you at the beginning, but now I can introduce the chapter of the books inside this mosaic of images. So I think Locsin has this facility to design buildings in different programs, but actually to always use same themes inside the buildings, like the moving grounds, the monumentality, organicism, and classicism tradition inside his architecture, which is very contemporary or modern, let's say. So he had this capacity to merge a lot of themes inside his buildings, and that was never really happening before that, because let's say, before Locsin there was a lot of good architecture, but that were probably more influenced by the international context. So at the end, Locsin managed to find a way to integrate these international influences with the tradition of the Philippines, with the climate, and proposed buildings that are really part of the country of the Philippines. So thank you for your attention. I am available if you want to write to me, if you have more questions. But I hope that, like me, you are fascinated by this work, which is really an impressive work of architecture. I think for me, it's one of the most important architects in the Philippines, obviously, but in Southeast Asia as well. And like, as my professor Bruno Marchand said, it's just amazing to see the freedom this architect had at that time, because they were not well known, so they were not maybe influenced by all the international context and the big master, the great masters. But on the contrary, they were so free that they could develop their own architecture, and that's probably the most important thing to think about it today. Is how can we develop architecture now without being influenced by everything we had on internet and in the magazines? And Locsin has this capacity to actually think of architecture in itself. Thank you very much.